Now look at planning. Understanding grant readiness. Readiness is a lot about the relationship between the university and the principal investigator in conducting the research or the externally funded project. Keeping in mind that sponsors issue awards to universities and institutions under the direction of the named principal investigator or PI, meaning that the award ultimately belongs to the university. Universities and institutions do review, approve, and submit proposals to a sponsor under the direction of the named PI. And finally, the university and institution may recover indirect costs to support the cost of the research.
Уважаемые участники вебинара, из-за технических неполадок у нас небольшая пауза. Просим вас подождать немного. Спасибо. Dear webinar participants, we apologize for the delay. We are experiencing some technical difficulties. Thank you.
Hello? Hello? Can you hear me now? Okay, hello? Do you want me to start over?
Hi, Chandra. Yes, we can hear you. Please proceed.
Okay, so should I start over from the beginning?
Yes, please.
Okay. Good afternoon. This webinar series, Best Practices in Research Administration, is being presented by Incura with the financial support of Eurasia Foundation and the U.S. Department of State. To download this presentation, please go to the handout section of your control panel. We will have 15 minutes Q&A at the end of the webinar. Please send your questions via the chat box in your control panel. My name is Shandra White, and I'm the Director of Sponsored Projects and Research Enhancement at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. This webinar, Proposal Development, is the first webinar in a 5-part series on best practices in research administration. As we go through proposal development today, the learning objectives for this course are to understand the skills and support needed for preparing and submitting responsive proposals for external funding, knowing how to think about and develop your research career, how to develop the research questions, and where to look for an appropriate sponsor and funding mechanism. To understand the level of detail required to utilize sponsor funding announcements, the mechanisms and guidelines to successfully organize and package a proposal. Knowing the steps for completing and packaging a grant proposal, and finally, managing the proposal development process. As part of the proposal development process, we will break it into 2 sections. For logistics, we will look at planning and preparation. Under planning, we will look at understanding grant readiness, identifying your research trajectory, identifying funding opportunities, selecting research questions. Under preparation, we will look at drafting the research idea, embracing logistics, meaning knowing, planning all the steps that are required and the components, focusing your research, obtaining feedback, returning to logistics, and finally submission of the proposal. Keeping in mind throughout the entire proposal development process, and even as you have funded proposals, that in applying for funding, the most successful and well-funded investigators manage the research, the logistics, and packaging of the proposal to successfully sell their stories. We will now go into planning. Under grant readiness, you want to understand the relationship between the university and the PI when you're conducting research or externally funded projects. Firstly, sponsors issue awards to universities and institutions under the direction of the PI. So the award ultimately belongs to the university or the institution. Universities and institutions are responsible for reviewing, approving, and submitting proposals to a sponsor under the direction of the named PI. And then finally, universities and institutions may recover indirect costs to support the cost of research. Note that indirect costs may also be referred to as facilities and administrative costs, depending on the funding announcement or the sponsor. As you're assessing grant readiness, one of the key things to understand and assess and get a clear understanding on are the university leadership expectations or requirements regarding effort that should be dedicated to external support and the university commitments, and how to balance these. For instance, managing teaching and committee work and other mentoring and things that a principal investigator or faculty may be responsible for, while managing the responsibility or requirement to obtain external support and the time that's dedicated to that, from proposal planning, writing, to managing projects. Under that, you also want to obtain mentoring. It's good to identify a network within your institution and without your institution in your specific field and in complementing disciplines as well. And also you want to make sure that you obtain and are consistent with obtaining self-mentoring, meaning attending relative conferences, participating in things like webinars, books, things like that, whatever you can do to also supplement the external engagements. You want to maintain, build, and strengthen your networks, your mentoring networks and colleagues. And it's not necessary to have a large, expansive network, but it is necessary to make sure that the network you have, no matter the size, is a strong network of people that you can rely on and that can in turn rely on you to help to mentor and strengthen them as well. Finally, you want to make sure that you are looking at how you build your CV through collaborations, preliminary studies, and joint publications. All of these are equally important in presenting a well-balanced CV that is a part of the proposal development process and a part of the proposal review process. As part of grant readiness, finally, you want to obtain training in the necessary supporting skills, such as really reading and interpreting sponsor funding opportunities and their calls. They can often have ambiguous information in them that you would need to spend a little more time clarifying, perhaps contacting a sponsor, reaching out to other colleagues, reaching out to other administrators in the field to make sure if something is unclear to really have a good understanding of what the sponsor is requiring. And then how to write appropriately for an external funding. There are different types of writing. There are academic writing, but proposal writing is also at the start and finish writing to sell your story, to sell your idea, to sell your project. And then understanding budgeting essentials, addressing all components of a full proposal submission, making sure that everything required by the university and the funding agency are addressed completely, and then addressing any places where they won't be. Establishing and maintaining good relationships with sponsors and colleagues, and then receiving ongoing training in the compliance aspects of your specific research, if it's hazardous materials or human subjects or animal subjects, just making sure that you stay current on any type of certifications or training, and also keeping abreast of changing regulations in those fields. And then finally, identifying and communicating with your university or institutional resources that support faculty researchers. And even though that's actually one of the most important things, it probably should be a top and a bottom, kind of balancing everything that you do, is making sure that you are aware of who supports you and that you have a good relationship and understanding of what they need. And then knowing that all successful PIs are able to manage all 5 components of grant readiness and constantly keep them in mind. When identifying your research trajectory, you should consider the long-term versus the short-term vision. Always keep in mind the long-term goal. Finally, what do you want to be known for when you retire? What do you want your research career to look like? What types of project do you see yourself doing over the next 15 to 25 years? And even though you're not at that 15 to 25 year mark, looking at how you build yourself up to getting to the types of projects that you want to be doing in that far out time frame. You want to develop an idea bank of potential research questions, and then organize them by the time to completion. Is this something that you can do within a year? Do you need more time, 3 years, 5 years, 10? And then, of course, the long range, 10 years and out. And you want to kind of have those identified, but also make sure that they are adaptable and can be changed. You want to have a range of subjects or topics, but also making sure that they are still applicable to your research. Make sure that they are representative of some type of translational or cross-disciplinary aspects. Also, you want to look at the project types, the types of projects that you normally engage in. Do you do service projects, quantitative, educational, or training type opportunities? If you are able to have a range or funding opportunities that allow you to take part in more than one type of research or funding activity, such as having some basic research, but also having some opportunities that also fit for education and training is also a good idea, because that allows you to have more exposure in the field. It allows you to contribute to the field, especially educating and training opportunities that will allow you to help to train and deposit into the next group of researchers in that area. You just want to make sure that you are developing a general vision of your research career path, but remain open to unique opportunities. Don't make your career path so niche that you limit yourself from being able to take advantage of spur-of-the-moment opportunities that may come up. When identifying your research trajectory, you want to refine your research questions. They should address a gap or an unmet need in the field. If you see that 300 people have a lot of research published or publications on something, the field may be getting a bit crowded, and you want to really spend some time looking into that to see where you can insert yourself and highlight something that is different, novel, or unique, and definitely necessary where maybe others are kind of missing something. So spend some time looking for that. Making sure that you're able to answer the significance of what it is that you're proposing. Again, if the field is really crowded, then definitely your significance can be that I'm addressing a hole, I'm addressing an unmet need here. And then your research questions should be able to evolve and pivot with new research in the field, looking at sponsor interests as they change or sponsor missions as they change, and then also, again, utilizing your network, any feedback that you receive from experts that tell you you need to look in a different direction or change the way that you're approaching a specific topic. And then make sure that your research questions are up to date and ready to help you take advantage of unique opportunities. For instance, Zika or Ebola, when those opportunities or those situations arose, there was a flurry of opportunities out, posted that required rapid response. And so if you have your research questions kind of ready and they're nimble enough, you are able to take advantage of those type of opportunities when they come up. When assessing a funding opportunity, it's good to keep a few key factors in mind. One would be the type of sponsor, whether they are government or private or corporate or industry. And the type of sponsor can affect a number of things. It can affect the type of regulations that guide and dictate what can or cannot be done. It can dictate whether or not there are indirect costs allowable or the rate of indirect costs. And there have, and as far as reporting requirements, whether it's financial or technological. And so a lot of that is influenced by the type of sponsor. And then what is the sponsor's stated mission? Always paying attention to what they're, not just what the proposal announcement's asking for, but what does that sponsor specifically say is their mission? Is their mission to, promote world peace? If that's what they're there for, then making sure that that is ingrained into and interwoven throughout the proposal, and that your proposal speaks to their specific mission. Whether they have budget restrictions, whether they have costs that are allowable, and then what costs are unallowable, and making sure that you stick to that. Noticing their financial and technical reporting requirements, and are you going to be able to comply and have the time to deal with the financial and technical reporting that they require. If they require quarterly reporting financially and technologically, will you have that type of time? Or technically, I'm sorry. And then cost sharing or in-kind requirements. If a sponsor is requiring that the institution support some of the costs of the initiative, that requires an institutional commitment, and so that does require some upfront conversations with your leadership to, in turn, to make an internal decision on whether or not you're able to pursue this opportunity based on the financial requirements and support that are necessary. Then, familiar and famous phrase, indirect costs. Are indirect costs allowable? Are indirect costs allowable with the announcement? Do they fit the indirect costs that your institution has set out already, or do you need to forego some indirect costs, and can you afford to forego the indirect costs? And that, again, usually requires some type of institutional approval, or just making sure that there's an institutional understanding. And then whether the research includes human subjects, animal research, or hazardous materials, and how to address the compliances that are required with that. When you're selecting your research questions, things to consider are the appropriateness of the mechanism for your career stage. If you're a new or beginning investigator, then attempting a really large collaboration that requires or may result in a lot of subawards and managing vendors and doing a lot of things with students and external collaborators may be a bit much for that career stage. However, if you are a senior investigator and have the support and the knowledge and the resources to take advantage of larger scale opportunities, then that would make that an appropriate mechanism for that stage of your career. Determining the congruence between your research and what the sponsor funds. There are oftentimes a announcement may look as if it's something that is really attainable and looks like it may be appropriate, but really dig down into what that sponsor has funded and is funding, especially if it's a announcement that they issue yearly or regularly, looking at what they've already funded and to see if they have made any shifts or changing in funding and who they funded, to make sure that you're not going to spend time on something that they may not even consider funding. And then make sure it fits well with your overall research career trajectory, as we discussed earlier, on how to really build that and have supporting research questions for that. Assess the collaborators and your availability to devote the sufficient time that's required to accomplish the scope of work. Make sure that the available support that you take and assess and what available support you have at your collaborating institutions in your own institution. whether the mentors and the co-investigators are available, whether you have the proper space, access to the proper facilities or technological equipment, computing facilities and things like that, making sure that you do have access to those things, and then if it costs you to access any of those things, specific space or facilities, making sure that you think about that when you budget. Looking at your schedule as a researcher, again, do you have the time, available release time, or do you need to secure release time from your institution? Looking at your teaching commitments, your advising load, travel requirements that you do have, time that you take away from the office normally, just making sure that you keep all of that in mind. And then finally, and most importantly, is the commitment. It's that the ability for all stakeholders, for yourself, your external collaborators, your subrecipients, vendors, students, your institution, for everyone to make that proposal and the project, if awarded, a priority. It's one thing to get the research funding in, it's another to be able to actually have the commitment to manage the project and to have a successful outcome. We'll now look at preparation. Under preparation, we'll look at starting with the research, embracing logistics, focusing your research, obtaining feedback, and then, of course, returning to your logistics and submitting the proposal. One thing to keep in mind during the preparation are what I call the 4 C's. A proposal should be compliant, it should be complete, should be compelling, and competitive. And a well-planned, responsive proposal will meet all 4 critical elements. Often the first C, compliance, is one that will have and could cause the proposal to be rejected immediately by the sponsor because it's missing some compliance features or it's incomplete. Those are the 2 things that don't even allow it to progress to finding out if the sponsor finds it compelling or competitive. So the 4 C's are also in an order that kind of feed into hopefully getting funded. So the first thing you do is you start with your research, of course. You want to revise and repeatedly polish your purpose statement or your introduction, your specific aims, the project summary, and the objectives based on feedback. Knowing that your purpose statement, it sets the tone for the entire proposal. It sets the expectation of what the reviewer is looking for and what they believe you're doing. If at any time anything along the route of the proposal, any of the other sections, other narratives, if they deviate from what you've initially said in your purpose statement, a lot of times that will cause the proposal to miss the 3rd C, which is compelling, because you lose the reviewer's attention. They try to figure out where you are or what you're talking about because you've lost them from the beginning, and they may then, again, stop reading the proposal or put it aside and move on to reviewing another proposal. When you're looking at that, you want to keep in mind that your introductory paragraph and your central hypotheses and purpose statements, all of these things really need to, again, feed up into one complete picture. And you always want to have someone reviewing this for you. Build in enough time to allow for a mentor or your department chair or someone or colleague or friend, whomever, to be able to look at this. You want to make sure that everything that you're presenting is logical and it remains consistent, that it should never, again, weave around or speak to something else. And then you want to have a strong conclusion that speaks directly to the sponsor's review criteria. The review criteria are often listed not in the proposal guidelines, but usually following that, and they outline what the review criteria are. some sponsors are gracious enough and transparent enough to even tell you how much each review criteria weighs in the review process. And if you are fortunate enough to have that type of information, really pay attention to that and balance your proposal based on those weightings. But whatever the sponsor's specific review criteria are, you want to make sure that you completely address that throughout the proposal, but really bring it home and make it clear in the conclusion. And so if a sponsor's review criteria includes significance and innovation, you really want to speak to that in the closing. If it speaks to which U.S. National Science Foundation specifically for years has called out broader impacts and intellectual merit as their two main review criteria that are overarching the rest of the proposal and any other requirements. You want to make sure that you address that. If the sponsor is really concerned about the impact that the research will make on society or on a specific group of people or anything like that, you want to make sure that you address that specific review criteria, even so much as using those words within the conclusion so that it's clear that you are speaking to that review criteria and that you understand their mission, you understand what they're looking for. And throughout the entire revisions and polishing of the proposal, you want to make sure that you're able to obtain feedback from your mentors or collaborator, and sometimes even the sponsor will allow you to reach out to them and ask them for feedback, just specifically whether you're on the right track. Is this something that fits within their study objectives? So how long does it take to prepare a proposal for an external sponsor? Well, that depends. It depends on how familiar you are with the content. It depends on how experienced you are with writing proposals and with working with your university research infrastructure. And then how familiar are you with that sponsor and with that specific funding opportunity? Is this a new funding opportunity for that sponsor? What is the size of your research team? How cohesive is that team? Have they worked together before? Do they work well together? Are there some relationships that you need to address prior to deciding to apply? And then the experience of that team. Availability of proposal assistance in the terms of the research infrastructure, but also in terms of having people to read and review your proposal for you, perhaps providing any editing assistance or things like that. And then the size of your team, again, and how interdisciplinary it is. One of that's a pretty big challenge to kind of mold together sometimes when you have different disciplines working on a singular proposal. You'll have different writing styles, different focus, things like that. So getting all of that together can add time to the proposal development process. And so keeping all of that in mind, you want to ensure adequate time for preparing the proposal. If you're a new investigator or if you're a seasoned investigator, but it's a major program or project, it's a large undertaking, it's a $50 million objective with lots of moving pieces and parts and a large team, then you want to give yourself at least 6 to 9 months for preparing the proposal. If it's a typical application and you've done this before or you've seen it before, you're familiar, you have kind of a good outline of something ready to go, your research team is either all ready to go or small and manageable, or it's just you yourself, then 4 to 5 months. And if everything's in great working order, this is a great team that you have, you've done this before, you're familiar, you've been waiting for this opportunity to come along, and then it can maybe be about 3 months from start to finish, and that's from looking at the proposal, assessing the opportunity, writing the proposal, getting feedback, and then going into actually submitting it. again, when you're assessing whether or not a proposal or an opportunity is good to a good opportunity or whether you're able to do it, you should really know and identify your key personnel and who will be the players on your project. One, yourself as the principal investigator or the project director, keeping in mind that as the PI, you are responsible for all aspects of the project, including the design, conducting the study, making sure that research is conducted in responsible and ethical manners, ensuring compliance, and then addressing financial obligations, financial management, the logistics, and the administration of it. So in essence, you're looking at yourself as head of an organization for this one project, or almost as a CEO, because you're managing all these aspects of the project that basically is turned into a mini entity while you're working on it. And understanding that as PI, do you have the time to really dedicate to managing all of that, or do you have a good support system to help you manage that? Then you have your co-principal investigator or co-investigator type person who will help you lead the project, and they may have equal status. However, they are not ultimately responsible for the project. It's always the main PI or project director who's ultimately responsible. You have co-investigators. There are other faculty members or other personnel, postdocs perhaps, who may assist in conducting the project. They may be within your institution. They may be at another institution. They may be present on your award through a sub-award or a subcontract or consulting, but they are always someone else kind of there who doesn't, but they don't have responsibility or even shared responsibility such as a co-PI would have. There are contractors, sometimes referred to as vendors, and those are non-employees who provide professional services for a fee. They could be a web design company or a company that picks up samples or fluids or takes things back to a lab and returns analysis of things that you have. So those would be your vendors or your contractors. And even though they are not responsible for research, they're not responsible for the conduct of the research, you do depend on them, so you want to make sure that you engage with a reputable and reliable professional service company. And then you have research assistants and postdoc scientists who also play critical roles within the project, and also it's critical for their research career development to be part of proposals and projects. One part of getting proposals, a lot of times sponsors may require letters of support. The letters of support can be requested from your institution, from external collaborators. If you're a newer investigator, it may be asking them for a mentor. You want to draft a unique letter of support to you from each type of entity or person that you need support letter from. If it's a co-investigator, if it's a collaborator, or if it's a consultant, anyone that's going to support the project, you want to have a unique letter that doesn't look like a form letter unless the sponsor requests that you use a specific form letter. Make sure you draft the letter and send it to the colleague or collaborator so that they can review it, make any edits they want to make or need to make, and then just simply sign and return it to you. If they have to draft the letter, it may take you either a while to get it or you may never get it. One thing to keep in mind, there are a couple notes here as far as the types of how to outline the letter. But one thing I would say to keep in mind is to make sure you address anything that the sponsor specifically requires that the mentor or collaborator or sponsor do as part of the project. If that's not included, oftentimes a collaborator or mentor may be surprised during the project at responsibilities that they've been asked to perform that they weren't aware of because it was not in the support letter. So make sure to address anything specific that the sponsor requires in that letter. You want to start your planning process early. You want to notify everyone, your department, the collaborators, your research administration units that you're going to provide, that you're going to do a proposal, and let them see the funding opportunity so they can understand what's required. You want to spend some time, again, just reading and understanding the funding opportunity, clarifying any ambiguous areas. And then you want to take the funding announcement and your markup of it or whatever you've done with it and create a timeline that kind of lists everything that's needed and who's going to be responsible for it. Some of the major components of a funding proposal are, and they vary by sponsor by the funding mechanism, but you require a summary, specific aims, your budget, bio sketches, the facilities, your letters of support, and then things that, compliance things, data management, how that will be managed, equipment, human subjects protections, and then responsible conduct of research, certifications, and training. When you're embracing your logistics and addressing them, you just want to make sure that you continue to identify and address any special requirements and immediately let your research administration units know. If it specifies that it's a contract or a cooperative agreement, and that's only because those types of mechanisms usually have more stringent terms and conditions. If you have teaming agreements or a limit on the number of proposals that can be submitted, if it specifically requests or requires that you have more than one institution participate, and then if it requires any special credentials or accounts to log into systems to submit the proposal. You want to make sure that you get those things taken care of early and ahead of time so that you can focus on just developing the research proposal. Always keeping in mind one thing, we talked about the different types of sponsors, especially when working with private sponsors, things like that. If your research possibly has any intellectual property or opportunities for collaboration, you want to talk with your technology or commercialization office or such infrastructure that you may have, and never underestimate the potential of your research. So always be sure to report the technology before you publish or even before you submit that proposal. You just always want to take the time to protect yourself and also to be able to take advantage of any opportunities that arise because of what you develop in your research. You want to create a timeline and a checklist based on the funding opportunity and the sponsor guidelines. You want to note every single required document and component. You want to note any budget limitations, any specifications that are required as how the budget should be broken out. Sometimes they tell you to list certain categories in a category that may not always make sense to you, but they may want things listed in a certain place. They may want you to break out what's a project activity from what's an administrative activity. So just, or break out participant activities. So always pay attention to not only the budget categories, but how they want the budget represented. If there are any limits or prohibitions or requirements for cost sharing or in-kind or matching funds from your institution, make sure that's part of your checklist so that you have the proper conversations and get the proper commitments from your internal support. Noting in the checklist how the grant should be submitted so that someone is in charge of making sure that you get the proper credentials, logins, passwords, system setups, things like that. Again, addressing the sponsor review criteria. If there are any formatting specifications, whether they require you to number your pages, whether they're allowing or if they want specific headers or footers. What fonts can you use? What should be the spacing, line spacing? What are the margins and page limits? Making sure to keep consistent and compliant with all of that, because those are compliance things that definitely, again, going back to the 4 C's, that's a compliance factor that could result in a proposal being rejected and not even seen for review, even though it may have great research and could be exactly what they're looking for. It won't make it through the sponsor's system just based on that. And then the internal routing informs requirements that are required for your institution. Make sure that those are also included in your timeline so that someone knows who's responsible for making sure that the routing is done and that internal approvals are secured. So here's a sample timeline, just kind of how you should think about it, just working backwards from the due date to the present date that you're going to submit, and kind of just work through that. And just make sure that you allow enough time for all required reviews and approvals, and monitor the progress regularly. Be checking in with everyone who's involved to see where they are, or have regular meetings if it's a large and long-range proposal. And use a detailed list of the components assembled from reviewing the funding announcement. And also, one note, you do want to allow additional time for technological complications. You want to make sure there's time for, if your systems are down or the sponsor's website maybe having problems or jammed or has a high level of activity, a proposal could not make it through a system because of that. So you always want to make sure that you allow time to address technological issues. And here's a sample timeline that has a large number of things just pulled out from the program announcement, and then you would list who would do it, when is it supposed to be done, and then being able to manage when this can be done. It can be placed maybe on a shared drive or Google Documents or something, so that everyone is able to go in, double check what they need to do, and then check off as they complete things, or and also to add things. So when you're doing your budget, you want to start early with your budget, revisit, realign your budget and your project with the project throughout the grant preparation process. Know who's going to help you with the budget. Kind of get out, thinking ahead of time about what your initial assumptions are about the budget. Develop a preliminary budget. Review and modify it as necessary as people look at it, as you remember certain things that need to be done, and really kind of do a walkthrough of the project, of the life of that project in your mind, to kind of sketch that out to really help you have a really comprehensive budget so that you will have exactly what you need to manage the proposal and manage the project. And you should expect to revise your budget a couple times during the process, but at some point you're going to have to make sure it's final, just like your proposal, and basically let it go. And one thing is to make sure that the narrative and the budget justification agree with the budget. That should always be two parts of the same story. Your narrative, budget justification, the actual proposal, and the final budget should all come together and basically tell the same story. There are a number of things to consider in your budget. What costs are limited and how they should be distinguished, the personnel and project roles and their time, fees for contractors, supplies, equipment, space. Is it going to cost you to rent space? Is there a space on your institution that you have to pay to utilize? Making sure that all of those considerations are included in the budget. How do these costs affect your indirect costs? Whether there's travel, conferences, food, and any unusual requirements, these should be well documented. A lot of sponsors don't want to pay for food or things that look like entertainment, so making sure that you clearly document and spell those out in your budget narrative. Any payments for human subjects should be included, participant costs, and publication costs, making sure you just And those are high-level things. There are always many more things that come up. Proposals and research are all unique, so there are always unique costs that may not be presented here. When you have collaborators at other institutions, you want to make sure that you give enough time for them to provide you with what they need or what you need from them, and give it at least 2 or 3 weeks for them, and I would probably even say a month. And you give them a deadline that's at least a week or two before your internal deadline to make sure you get what you need from them. And they basically have to provide a mini proposal. They have to do, a scope of work, a budget, letters of intent signed by their organization that they're going to participate with you, any indirect rate agreement they may have, and then any other documentation that your sponsor or your institution requires. So it's basically a mini proposal, not as much as what you have to do, but there's still something that they need to provide, and all of those documents should be complete enough to use to form your subaward or sub-agreement with them once the grant is awarded. If you have cost sharing, again, just reminding you to, that this is something that the institution has to pay, so there should be discussions with the institution officials, whoever is responsible for approving and making those commitments. Those questions and should be asked early and commitments secured early. One thing to note is that cost shared is not always guaranteed that they're going to get funded. So really, it should only be done if it's required by the funding opportunity or agency, or if it's really necessary to support a very high-profile project that the sponsor award ceiling just doesn't cover all of the necessary costs, but never just as something, just to throw in to hopefully get the proposal funded. Most times that's not a good strategy or a successful strategy. Then you want to just make sure you focus your research. Once you have your specific aims and everything, you draft the rest of your narrative. You want to make sure you strictly follow the sponsor's guidelines, package all of the documents to support your request, make sure it looks good, have somebody look at it, looking at your margins and your fonts and your headings and how it's laid out, and make sure you use vivid writing, make it sing, make it, appealing to read, and make sure it's clear, concise, make sure it tells a story, it draws the reviewers in, and it keeps them there. And don't use any jargon or things that specifically the sponsor says they don't want to see. Never include them. And just, again, make sure you address the sponsor review criteria directly. Then you want to obtain feedback on your narrative. You want to give it to your mentors, your collaborators, if the sponsor will give you any feedback, and any external reviewers that you may have access to. It is crucial that you provide yourself time in the timeline to receive feedback and to incorporate it. Sometimes I've seen faculty get feedback, but they don't allow themselves the time to even incorporate it or to really go through it. And so you can have a disjointed sounding proposal if you don't have time to fully and clearly incorporate any feedback that you receive. Then you just want to make sure that while your mentors and collaborators are reviewing the narrative, you finalize everything. Finalize your research strategy, all of the narrative sections. Make sure that your bio sketches are clear, complete, compliant. Your letters of support are obtained, and that they're all signed and ready to go and uploadable in a way that clear when they upload, making sure that you address any unique features in your facilities and your resources, that you have your sub-agreement documentation, any cover letters if it's required, any subject, human or animal subject protection certifications, or documentation that needs to be included in the proposal, and then anything else that's required, whether they have certifications, letters of support. Just making sure, again, going back to your checklist, that you have everything addressed and ready to go while you may have a final review. One thing to note about facilities and resources, just make sure you tailor this to your specific grant application about what makes it unique about your institutional environment. And there are a number of things. It can be a university's rank. It can be the type of training that you have, type of facilities you have. But just make sure that you, whenever you have a facilities resources requirement, that you make it unique to your grant proposal and not just some standard off-the-shelf boilerplate information that your institution may have. When you're ready to submit, I would suggest giving yourself 5 business days before the sponsor deadline to make sure you have everything final, meaning your sponsor forms, your budget, the proposal, letters of support, statements of work, budget, and all of the stuff from your collaborators. And then allow yourself at least 2 days before to have everything completed, your final research narrative and everything, and be ready to submit at least 2 days before, again, to allow yourself time to address any technological complications. Just a quick note that early submission, and this is a chart that you might want to look at in more detail later, but from our National Institutes of Health, indicated that early submission at least it guarantees that your proposal will be reviewed. It won't be kicked out for non-compliance because you weren't rushing to get it in and maybe missed compliance things, or that it was so badly put together that they just did not take the time to read it. So it's always important to just make sure it gets its foot not just in the door, but that it's able to make it to the table and get read. So now you've gotten the proposal in 2 days before you submit. What's next? You congratulate yourself, thank everyone who assisted you. You get to breathe, relax. You did it, it's gone. You wait for the review, and now you begin considering the next proposal and start back over from step 1, planning. This concludes my presentation today. To find out more about NCURA, please go to www.ncura.edu. Okay, now it is time for Q&A. Okay, so now time for Q&A. So, box keeps moving, sorry. So one question is, what is meant by cost sharing? So cost sharing are costs that the sponsor may ask the institution or university to provide as part of the proposal. So let's say the sponsor says that they will give $200,000 for this proposal opportunity, but they expect the cost to be $300,000. What they're saying is that they would like the university to share in the cost of this opportunity by providing at least $100,000 from their own resources. Those don't happen all the time, but I'd probably say about 30% of funding opportunities do have such requirements that they want the institution to show a commitment to the success of the project, or it could just be that the sponsor has limited funds. And so they have a specific amount of funding available for this opportunity, and in order to fund the number of projects that they would like to fund, they will need the institution or university to contribute some of the funding. Okay, another question is this funding proposal applicable to humanities, especially English literature and criticism, or is it just for sciences? What I understand is such proposal writing for grants is more applicable to sciences. rather than humanities. So no, actually humanities, the proposal development process and all of these aspects of proposal writing, proposal development, it applies to proposals for any and all disciplines. I would say that some of the sections that were listed, things such as a research strategy or specific aim, that might not be the way that it's listed in a proposal for the humanities. They may simply, they may reword those sections. It may be called an executive summary. They may ask for an abstract. They may ask for a project strategy or something like that as opposed to a research strategy. But with the proposal development process, it would be the same for any type of proposal, whether it is humanities or science-based. I would say that one thing in the humanities proposals, a lot of times, sometimes they may not be as labor-intensive in some of the requirements, and so that might be one of the differences. But the proposal development process should basically be the same and kind of follow the same process. I'm sorry, I'm having a little question. There's a new question. Let's see. Any suggestions or strategies on how to reuse or recycle a proposal? I would say for those, you definitely want to look at that same funder, perhaps sometimes, seeing if they have other opportunities that specific type of work may apply to, talking to the program officer if they do not fund a proposal, asking them how can I use this better? Is there some place that we can use this? Would you consider funding this under a different part of your institution or organization? And then definitely looking at other organizations, doing some key searching for funding opportunities using keywords from your proposal. And my colleague, Tricia Callahan, will speak more to finding funding opportunities in the next series, part 2 of the series. But I would definitely say looking at the same funder sometimes and just talking to your project officer to ask them, is there a way that you can reuse this, or what could you better do to retool it? Let's see. Asking another question, who is the PI and where do he or she come from? So the PI is principal investigator. That would be the faculty researcher at your institution. Most times they may be at another institution as well. So that could be a co-PI, but it's just the principal investigator, and they're normally at that institution that's actually proposing to do the research or the project. What is the maximum limit? When the maximum limit of funding is, for instance, $20,000, do you think it's okay to request the maximum, or is it better to stick to the trend of lowering the budget? No. I would say ask for exactly what you need. If the maximum funding is $20,000 and you need $20,000 to do that proposal, then you specifically ask for that. If you don't need $20,000 to accomplish the work that you are proposing to do, then don't ask for 20, but definitely ask for exactly what you need within their funding ceiling. It's not usually, from what I have observed over the years, it's not usually a case of low bidding or anything like that. It's just what's the best project that we can get done for the money. And so that's what I would say is to whatever you need to do your project, that's what you should propose. Let's see, next question. what are human subject compliances if there are no such advisory committee in the institution? So that is a consideration. There are oftentimes when human subjects, animal subjects, the different types of certifications that may be necessary, specifically in some U.S. funding, may not be present in some international institutions or settings. But those are things that are assuring when you're using humans in your research. Let's say you're going to have the humans participate. It could be from a humanities point of view, it could be that you're going to have children that you're going to read stories to that have to then report back on how they benefited from the story, or from a scientific point of view that you're going to draw blood from people or use them for use and have some other type of thing like that. That is where you have human subjects involved, and your sponsor normally wants some assurances on how the human subjects will be selected and how they be treated. And next question, may international research funding sources fund governmental bodies? And that would depend on the funder and the specific research, the specific funding source. Sometimes funding is limited, and it may say that no governmental entities may apply, but sometimes it does. So it would definitely depend on the funding mechanism and the opportunity and what their restrictions are. And I think, one more question. Let's see, how often does your institution contact the funding agency program officer during proposal development? At my institution, very little, but it depends. Sometimes the faculty person may have a relationship with the program officer, or to start a relationship with the program officer. It's always a good idea to call them if they're open to receiving phone calls to ask about the specific project that you want to propose. We don't contact them a whole lot, and that would probably say from the research administration office, but from the faculty perspective or the researcher, they may contact them a lot more just because they're forming a relationship with that sponsor. Let's see. One more question. What is the best way to train my staff on proposal development? I would say you want to outline the proposal process from start to finish, and then begin looking at what your staff's role is in each part of that proposal development process. It depends on what they will be doing, whether they will be developing budgets, whether they are looking at narratives, whether they are just specifically addressing the completion of each section of the proposal, but having them understand the process as we've kind of went over here, and then having them outline what that process looks like and what their role is in each thing and in each aspect, and then understanding the specific institutional compliance or guidelines that are around each of those processes, and then being able to adapt to the differences in each sponsor as they have those types of, as their announcements kind of have to be balanced with what the institutional requirements are. Let's see. When a patent results from sponsored research, will sponsors share the rights of the patent? That is a question for between the university and that sponsor, and that's why it's important to identify such opportunities early in the proposal process so that you can talk to the sponsor and perhaps negotiate that. And you definitely want to negotiate that ahead of time. You want to say, we can share the rights. We can, we don't want to give you exclusive rights here. We want to share that. So you want to make sure that you have arrangements in place before you submit the proposal in order to protect any technology or IP or anything like that. But they may not always share, and so that may be a point where you may have to say you can't do the proposal if they don't want to share, if they're not going to allow you to have access to your intellectual property or patents. It just depends. Let's see if there are any more questions. I believe that's all of the questions. Yes, I believe that's all the questions. So let's see. Okay, there's one more question coming. Two more questions coming. Okay, holding. Okay, and while I'm waiting for the additional questions, okay, here's one. Let me see. Which areas of research were the most in demand for 2016 or received the most amount of funding? Are there statistics on this? Most likely there are. I don't have them in front of me. I would say, you know, for my institution, we have a medical school here, so for us, the types of things that have paid off mostly have been large, long-range studies on eradicating HIV/AIDS, addressing the Zika virus. Those were really large-ranging, and then in large amount and large payoff is in terms of the length of the study and how much money the funders were proposing for them. Let's see, biomedical research is a big field, and it will probably be for quite some time to come. So I would say those are areas in the, let's see, in humanities type research or type proposals. I would say anything that can balance and contribute to part of the STEM initiatives, things like that. Those are important areas as well. Let's see. Next question. If research does not achieve goals and objectives, what should the researcher do? Is there any commitment toward the sponsor? It depends on the research. So if and how the research was awarded, which why it's very important to understand the type of opportunity or the type of funding that will result from a proposal. If it's going to result in a grant is usually is much more forgiving if you don't meet the project objectives, not if you don't do them, but if the research turns out such that what you thought would happen did not happen. A grant is more forgiving in that but different for a contract or collaborative agreement. In those, the sponsor is looking for a specific type of outcome or leaning towards specific outcomes in terms of actually accomplishing a goal. So there really is a commitment and a responsibility for the faculty and the institution for meeting the objectives that are proposed under anything that's going to result in a contract or a cooperative agreement. Let's see, next are how important of letters are support for a successful research proposal. They are very important when they're, especially if they are required. If a sponsor requires them, they are important, and they really should work to obtain letters of support from the people or people that really would lend credibility to the research or to the project. So whenever a sponsor requests a letter of support, it's important because sponsors don't ask for anything that they are not going to review. Because of the number of proposals they receive, they don't have a lot of time to review them. So if they're asking for something, it's important. There were actually, let's see, a couple questions earlier. If I have time, I can do them. They were, who's responsible for putting together a proposal, research administrator or the PI, or principal investigator? This is a collaborative venture. However, the principal investigator is responsible basically for supplying everything that's needed for a proposal, the research, the narrative, the technical, all of that is the intellectual property and comes from the mind of the PI. So they would be supplying all of that. They might work in conjunction with their research administrator on developing the budget, on ensuring that they develop the proposal responsively and have all of the required sections and required information, all of the certifications. They may have to work with other offices with their research administrators to obtain that. But as far as actually putting together a proposal, it's kind of a collaborative venture with the PI at the helm of it, at the lead, because the PI is responsible for directing the research and creating the project. Let's see, another question is, what is the typical success rate for a proposal? Depends. What I see most times is a proposal or a specific research idea may have to be submitted maybe about 3 times, especially for a new investigator, 3 different times, polish it, reuse, recycle it, address any comments from your sponsor, any feedback that you receive on review, and resubmit if they allow it. And sometimes that may take about 2 or 3 times to get that through. We talked to one of our researchers here recently, and she submitted 23 proposals, and of the 23 proposals, she has 7 funded. So you're definitely going to submit more than you receive in funding, but every submission hopefully should lead to presenting a better proposal for either another round or to a different sponsor. And one more question, what are the most common mistakes that you have seen in proposals? Common mistakes are not having bio sketches in the proper format. That's a big key one. Not addressing formatting requirements such as page numbers or spacing, things like that. Not having sections in the right order, and also just missing the timeline, being late to submit, and sometimes hoping that you'll get a proposal in if it's due at 4 o'clock and you're still trying to work on it at 3 o'clock and pushing to the very last minute. And I've seen there are some sponsors that their submission portal actually shuts down and closes at the specific time. So I have seen proposals just completely not get in because of not having a good timeline to submit, sorry. Let's see. Next question, does the funding agency have the right to ask the PI to modify his proposal? Well, yes, the funding agency can ask the PI to modify something. They normally tell you why. They may say, you know, we're able to fund and work on these 3 things that you presented, but parts 4 and 5 we can't do, or we don't feel are very necessary, or we don't have the money to do those parts. So can you revise the proposal to only address these pieces here so that we can actually fund you? So it's kind of a good thing when a sponsor is coming back and ask you to make revisions, because that normally means they want to fund it. But again, as the PI has the right also to say, well, I don't want to change this, or I can't change it, and if I change it, I don't really accomplish anything. And so they do have that right to do that. Okay, and it looks like we are out of time. So this concludes my presentation today. To find out more about NCURA, please go to www.ncura.edu. And if you have any questions about proposal development, please feel free to contact me at Shandra at email.gwu.edu. And if you have other questions about research administration, please contact Jesse Zito, Director of NCURA Global, at sveto@ncura.edu. And we hope that you will be able to join us for next week's webinar. Tricia Callahan, Director of Proposal Development at University of Miami, Ohio, will be presenting on how to use databases to find sources of funding. Before you exit the webinar, please fill in the post-webinar survey. You can find the link to the survey in the chat box. Thank you.